Well, I was sort of drafted into it, you know. Hall Johnson had a play called Run Little Children, and he r- got me requisitioned, so to speak, to play the part of Brother Moses in this. It was a folk play about people who were God-fearing and righteous and holy were confronted with what they considered a heathen cult who pitched a tent on a vacant lot near this little town, and a lot of the good church-going people were attending, the ceremonies of this pagan cult, and it caused a lot of conflict, and therein lies the drama. It was marvelous music. Hall Johnson composed music for the cult that sounded very mysterious and strange, but enticingly beautiful. So there was this pagan music in counterposition to wonderful spirituals that only Hall Johnson could concoct, and it was very nice. The Federal Theater? Well, just as we have Jesse Helms today, we had his counterparts, or maybe his, what do you call it, ancestors then, because they regarded anything as cultural somehow less than right. It was they feared it, and they considered it subversive and un-American, whatever that means. But at any rate, they gained power in Congress and in the lawmaking bodies and policy makers, and it brought about the demise of the Federal Theater eventually. Of course, when you consider the fact that anything that is of grassroots basis, and these were ordinary people expressing the experiences of their common lives, and in the course of that expression, they don't care what is officially approved, so there it is. It's thought-provoking. And thinking is dangerous in this country. It might lead to ideas of maybe some planning or something like that. And planning is a cuss word even to this day. So one thing leads to another, and anything that is strange somehow is regarded with suspicion and fear. It doesn't have to be at all necessarily dangerous or anything like that. It's just different, and they don't like difference. They like conformity and familiarity. That's the reason why you have to search for something which is really creative and original in this cultural scene, because everything has to conform, be familiar. It was a sense of liberation. I felt, of course, many of the dramas with significant social content, unfortunately, I didn't get a chance to play in them. I would have enjoyed it tremendously. But for example, there were people who objected to the Swing Mikado. The Swing Mikado was basically Gilbert and Sullivan's light opera, The Mikado. Originally, of course, it was a British production. It evolved out of the British political system, and it was a hilarious satire on the British political system. It had nothing to do with Japan. But when it came to the swing version of it, people objected. Why? Because it was a novel treatment of an old standard classic. And I was in a show later called Street Scene, music by Kurt Weill and book by Elmer Rice. And Morant had a song called Let Things Be Like They Always Was. And that's the sentiment that you get from then and continues to this day. In my view, I didn't see any evidence of a feeling of threat. Right? But once you get something going, you don't know where it's going to wind up. So when you start with Negro authors and Negro performers on subjects which they select themselves for performance and treat that subject from their viewpoint, irrespective of what somebody else might think about it, why then that's where you get the potential for opposition. First of all, the lyrics and the dialogue is side-splittingly funny. And my friend, Jester Harrison, played the role of Coco to my role of Pooh Bah, which meant that we had a lot of dialogue together. And Hairston is a comedian that you just can't put him in a class with anybody else. He's in a class by himself as a comedian. The way he could deliver a line was devastating. And I would feed him a line, and of course he would have to reply to it. And his reply would crack me up on the stage. I had to fight to keep from just rolling on the floor. That was about the most stimulating experience I've ever had in the theater. It was an opportunity for me, certainly, to get in the theater, get in a play, and start learning the art of actor. I had been a student of singing for quite a number of years, and combining singing with acting was just wonderful. I discovered later that I didn't have a purely operatic voice. It wasn't that strong. But for a musical play, and most particularly on the concert stage, why, it was up to me to select the material which I could handle, and I was able to handle material fairly well, I think. But it just, as I said before, you have a sense of freedom and an opportunity to express ideas which other people can listen to and maybe be stimulated in some way in the course of their lives. You know, it's a wonderful thing. It was a cultural explosion in this sense. For example, before the advent of the Federal Theater, there were millions of people who had never seen what they called a round actor. That is, somebody in person on a stage delivering lines and going through actions. Up to that point, it was only the movies, you know, they were pictures. But here is a person speaking to them, and it was electrifying. It laid the basis of what theater is today. There are more people going to the theater, despite the high prices, and there are more smaller theaters where prices are lower. But people are now anxious to come to a place where another person is standing on the stage, telling them things and interacting with each other, and portraying episodes which they can relate to and take as a part of their lives. The sentiment, as I was able to perceive it at the congressional level, was that all of this was just wasted money, because it was a luxury. It didn't produce wealth, you know. Had it produced wealth, of course, they would have immediately appropriated it unto themselves, and the people wouldn't have benefited. But it was something, you know, wasting money on people dancing and singing and play acting, you know. It's not worth it. Cut it out. Well, it was indignation and a sense of outrage. You know, practically every other country in the world offers a certain amount of subsidy, in some cases complete subsidy, for the arts. And now, South Africa was, at one time, the initials were the same as this country, USA, Union of South Africa. And the two USAs in the world were just about the only two so-called civilized nations that didn't subsidize their arts. And that was a pretty stern commentary, and it still stands. But yeah, I thought that something very important was being lost. And that feeling still is present. Well, of course, I went back to trying to build a concert career. That is after World War II. You know, I took it with me. When I came east, I was involved in about 15 Broadway shows, and you know, I kept on at that. When I found out about the attack on Pearl Harbor, I was with the Hall Johnson Choir doing the music for a movie called Tales of Manhattan. And we were in the midst of singing a tune. Good news, good news, good news, good news, good news, good news, Lord, I heard from heaven today. And right in the midst of that, the door opened and a man with a solemn face said, The Japanese have just attacked Pearl Harbor. We're in the war. Now, what a unique position to be in at that point, singing what I was singing with that group of people. And that's how I found out about the war. There were, you know, exhibits depicting the future and all of that kind of business, and a lot of concessions where a lot of junk was sold, and, you know, that didn't impress me a whole lot. Not that soon, no, I didn't. I really didn't. To me, of course, there had been a lot of talk about, of course, the Japanese had already been involved in China and all that. And I remember in a political sense, being interested in all this talk about, well, we shouldn't be shipping scrap iron to Japan because it's going to come back to us in the form of bombs and shrapnel and all that kind of stuff. But there was a lot of bellicose rhetoric floating around at that time. But the actual attack came as a surprise to me. You know, of course, there was the famous or infamous America First Committee, you know, who tilted toward Hitler, you know, and Father Coughlin on the radio and people like that. There were those who said, let's stop Hitler and all that, but the majority of the people I associated with took the position that it was an imperialist war and that as working people they had no part in it, you know. But of course, with the attack on the Soviet Union, the character of the war changed, because we were for working people, and this was a worker state, and an attack on a worker state is considered as an attack on the working class. So, bingo. The decision was basically taken out of my hands. I had to continue living. And all of my plans for concerts and lecture recitals and things of that sort suddenly went down the tube because everything was canceled. And I came back to San Francisco, and I was casting about for something to do. So at that time, I was always interested in some mechanical skills with engines and things like that. And I enlisted in the Samuel Gompers Trade School and learned welding. And subsequently, and very easily, got a job at Marin Ship as a welder. In 1942, I went to the shipyard and I got a job. And I don't know how long I was at work, a month or less, when somebody asked me, were I a union member? And I said, no. I said, well, you have to join the union. I said, well, that's fine. Where do I go? Where's the headquarters of the union? He said, you don't go to union headquarters. I said, why not? I'm going to join the union, am I not? No, but there's a special union for you, us, he said, because he is also a Negro. And I said, I don't understand. He said, look, We are not allowed to join the main union, but the main union has for us a separate organization to which we have to belong. I said, let me think about this. And so finally I asked some questions, and I found out that this was an auxiliary. I found out that to the initiation fee to join was the same. The due structure was the same. But the benefits were 50% of what a white person would get belonging to the union. And I said, I'm not going to put up with this. And that's the beginning of the... I said myself at first that I'm not going to put up with this. And then in conversation, I found that others felt the same way. And we finally came to a formal decision that this which we were being subjected to was essentially the same thing that Hitler would subject us to, or worse. We would not be a part of whatever was promulgated by fascism. We would be segregated, we would be persecuted, we would be even murdered. And it's that sort of thing that we're engaged in a war against. So it would be illogical and inconceivable and not even moral to put up with a situation like that on the home front while trying to eliminate that sort of a thing in a foreign land. And it was under that compulsion that when they came and asked me to be the spokesman for the budding organization, I gladly consented. I found the actual work experience very pleasant and stimulating, because in something like welding, especially electric arc welding, you see that marvelous picture of melting metal coming together over, say there's a crack there, and you see that crack filling up. And then after you have welded along on a seam, you throw your hood back and take your goggles off, and you look at that beautiful seam of gleaming metal, and it's just beautiful. And you get a sense of accomplishment because you can see before your eyes what you have done, you know. And when a ship is welded, it's one piece. All of these various components are sewn together, so to speak, so that the complete hull is just one big piece of steel. And it's a marvelous thing. You know, with very minor, minuscule exceptions, it was like a big family. I think mainly what tied everything together was the fact that we were engaged in a battle literally for survival, because everybody knew that if we lost that struggle against Germany, Italy, and Japan, the big imperialist powers at that time, we would all be in a terrible state. And that's what held us together. Also, the fact that everybody, and this is important, everybody was employed and were making enough to support their families and all that, removed a lot of the anxiety, you know, and people cooperated with each other. If somebody got injured, everybody helped to get the person to help get the stretcher or whatever it is. And that's the way it was. Yes, it drew people together. I remember a white fella from, I don't know where he was from, but he was from the Deep South. And he fell in some kind of a crack on the deck of one of the ships. And everybody rushed to his aid. And it was a demonstration of cooperation. It's I wish that spirit was still present. Yes, you see, the irony was that on the home front, people were working together. One of the welders on the team of hydro test welders that I finally became a part of. He was Chinese. There was another one who was Spanish speaking. I don't know what country he originated from. He probably have been Chicano, he'd probably come from Mexico. And it was a little United Nations, that crew of welders. And but the irony was that in the armed forces, it was segregated. you know, it's just the paradoxes that are just the bane of this country. The war, because of the conditions of the war, people had a sense. That is, I mean, working people. These people who were on the top manipulating things for their own, economic or physical or political ends. They had another agenda. But people tend, when working together, to adopt a common agenda. Survival in this case. And it carried through to the end of World War II. And then things began to fall apart. People went back to their old prejudices and the lesson didn't stick, in my view. I was saying that during the Depression times, and the situation varied depending on what part of the country you were in. In the Deep South, it was another situation. There was still that antagonism against white and black. And things were very dangerous in the South during the Depression for black people. The lynchings reached a height during the Depression. And you got the situation where people of different racial groups were living close to each other and going through the same difficulties. And they were more easily organized around common issues. And you got the spectacle of people of different ethnic groups working in cooperation with each other. Well, because there was an absence of the compulsions that were active in the South. By that I mean this: in the Deep South, if a white person stood up in defense of a black person, the black person and the white person would probably be lynched. The common word was nigger lover. You know, a nigger lover and a nigger were the same thing practically. You know, it wasn't that blatant in the North, and there was an opportunity for people to see their kinship and, moreover, do something about it. During the Depression, as I experienced it, I didn't have any feelings of, say, how long is this terrible situation going to last? When is it going to get better? Or anything like that. I lived my life from day to day and dealt with what I encountered during the course of the day, and the next day I did the same thing, and on and on and on and on. I didn't give much thought to the conditions or whether they would improve or not. I wasn't conscious of any significant improvement in conditions. And, of course, the outbreak of the war, as far as the United States was concerned, actively, brought about an immediate change of how you'd proceed, as I've mentioned previously. But conditions overall, perhaps because I wasn't analyzing things as I was living. I was just dealing with problems. The most important part of it, of living through the Depression, strangely enough, probably, is the theater. That was as I remember, that was the most vivid part of the Depression as far as I experienced it. And when the theater was killed, I had a feeling, as I said before, of outrage and a sense of loss, of course. But the one thing that the Depression, in my view, taught the American people was, incidentally, they seem to have forgotten it, that when they come together, something can be accomplished. One thing that the Depression, the experience of the Depression, taught the American people was that when they came together around common problems, they could get something together. They could accomplish something. For example, Social Security, unemployment insurance, things like that. It took struggle and a tremendous amount of work, but it was accomplished. The election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the accomplishments that were made under his administration, the Wagner Act that guaranteed the right of working people to organize unions. All of those things were accomplishments stemming out of the Depression. Now, unfortunately, it seems that the people, working people now, seem to have forgotten that, or if they have ever knew of it. Uh, Probably because there's not much written or spoken about it in public circles. They're being whittled away, but I look forward to the time when the people will again become active and and do something for themselves as they did in the 30s. That's indescribable. The thought of these people being shipped off to what was fancifully called relocation centers. They were concentration camps. Let's tell the truth about it. My next door neighbors and friends were a Japanese family, the Tatamotos. When we would go out on a concert tour or out of town for any reason, we would give them our keys. They would water our garden, take care of our plants, take in mail, and all of that stuff for us. And it was likewise with them. And they were our friends. The same elements, interestingly enough, who were responsible for the banishment of the Japanese ancestry people were the same elements that we were fighting on the basis of discriminatory policies. After I got more into the purely general civil rights struggle, being involved with the NAACP and all that, that's where I made that discovery that the very ones who were clamoring for the banishment of the Japanese people were the ones who tried to maintain segregation and discrimination amongst not only Asians but black people and all non-white people. This was the same. Well, that's right. They couldn't. Um, uh, they later began to organize and all like that. Notably, the Japanese American Citizens League, which was patterned roughly after the NAACP, and to an extent which I wished had been greater, the NAACP and the JACL worked together. In fact, I'm an honorary member of the JACL. See, patriotism, in my view, doesn't mean going along with somebody's dictate, you know. I have my feeling about this country, the country of my birth, and I would defend it. But when somebody tells me that I have to be less than a citizen under the guise of being patriotic, I said, well, now, wait a minute. You're putting a definition of patriotism upon me which I cannot sustain. Now, we in this organization of shipyard workers, non-white, said we're perfectly willing to join the union, but not this Jim Crow auxiliary. So accordingly, we offered to go to the union and apply for membership, and it was refused. It had to be this auxiliary, or else we would be dismissed from our jobs. Accordingly, the time came when we began receiving so-called pink slips. Thereupon, we called a big meeting, a mass meeting, at which, after hours and hours and hours of debate, we adopted the strategy of going in shifts. As each shift of workers was dismissed, he would join the previously dismissed workers in a tour of all of the war offices in the San Francisco area. The War Production Board, the President's Committee on Fair Employment Practices, the War Labor Board, and all of those agencies. And as the numbers increased, the demonstration increased. Meanwhile, Harry Bridges, the late Harry Bridges, offered us the use of the Union Hall for a dance. And we raised a tremendous amount of money to us these days, and those days, and it financed a court injunction, which resulted in the firing being halted, and we all went back to work. And that was the first phase of the struggle. It felt wonderful. When we got that injunction, we cheered. It was a grand feeling. If I would say, well, look, I came all the way up here to get a job, you know, and I'm working, and I don't want to cause any trouble or anything like that. And the reply to that was simply, it's not a matter of starting trouble. It's a matter of insisting on your rights as a citizen. That's all. And there isn't anything that'll happen to you which hasn't been always happening to you all along. And also, we are not alone. There are many who think as we do and will support us. And as it turned out, that was correct. Undoubtedly, that's right. When somebody comes from, remember, this was in the late 30s and in the early 40s and all that. And people were being denied the vote. They were being lynched if they tried to organize the vote. And it took a big step for these people coming from that type of an environment to join this struggle for equality. Although, despite the fact that there was a war going on. And I think that was quite remarkable, and I have a great respect for people as a result of that. Surprisingly enough, I wasn't accused of slowing down the war effort. And neither were the people with whom I was associated accused of that. And it showed the degree of understanding among people. From the very beginning, we said that we were perfectly willing to work to defeat the Nazis and the Axis. And we would only stop if we were forced to by those who are trying to persecute us. And that was made clear. Interestingly enough, concurrently with this work in the shipyard, I had a little late-night radio program where I sang songs and explained things and all that. And it was on radio station KGO, the Blue Network of what was then NBC. And one day, the special events man from the station over which I was singing stuck a microphone under my nose and said, this is Joe James, the spokesman for the workers, and Joe, I want you to tell the listening audience what the issues are in this. And boy, did I tell them. And when I got home, I got a telephone call. It says, Mr. James, your radio program is canceled as of now. What an interesting tie-in. And that was one of my early lessons in how various interests are interlocked. Not one of the Boilermakers Union officials confronted me or anybody else face to face and eye to eye. The only time we met and had very little conversation, in fact, no conversation, was in the courtroom during a recess. No.